Every town has a family that seems completely ordinary on the outside. The kind of family no one questions. No rumors. No headlines. No warning signs that anything could ever go wrong. In this quiet suburban neighborhood, that family was the Justus family. To their neighbors, the Justuses lived a simple, stable life. Robert Justus worked long shifts at a local manufacturing plant. He was known as quiet, respectful, and dependable, not particularly social, but reliable in a way that made people trust him. His wife, Elaine, was the opposite in many ways. Warm, expressive, active in church events, and always involved in school activities. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, brought meals to sick neighbors, and never missed a community gathering. Their 3 children completed the picture of normality. Sarah, Daniel, and little Michael were well-behaved kids who rode bicycles down the same peaceful streets every afternoon, returning home before sunset. From the outside, there was nothing unusual about their home either. A modest 2-story house with a neat lawn, clean windows, and a quiet porch. It blended into the neighborhood perfectly, like it had always belonged there. But sometimes, normal lives hide quiet fractures that no one notices until it's too late. In the months before the tragedy, subtle changes began around Robert. Co-workers noticed he had grown increasingly withdrawn. Conversations that once felt casual now ended quickly. He avoided eye contact, often staring into space during breaks. One colleague later recalled a moment that stood out in hindsight. Robert had said, almost casually, "Something feels wrong lately, like something is coming." At the time, it was dismissed as stress or exhaustion. Everyone deals with pressure in different ways. No one thought much of it. At home, Elaine began noticing small but unsettling changes. Doors that were locked at night would sometimes be found slightly open in the morning. Lights flickered without explanation. The family dog began refusing to enter certain rooms, especially the hallway leading toward the basement. Sarah, the eldest daughter, also became uncomfortable in the house. She once told a friend that the basement felt off, like someone was standing down there when no one was supposed to be. Still, nothing was reported. Nothing was investigated. Families go through phases. Children imagine things. Stress builds quietly and passes. Life continued as usual on the surface. But beneath that surface, something was beginning to fracture inside the Justus home. And no one in the neighborhood realized that this ordinary family was slowly moving toward a night that would change everything forever. As time passed, the small changes inside the Justus household began to grow harder to ignore. What once felt like isolated moments of stress or fatigue slowly turned into patterns that no one could fully explain. Robert Justus, once steady and predictable, began acting in ways that unsettled even Elaine. He would wake up in the middle of the night and stand in the hallway for long stretches, completely still, as if listening for something no one else could hear. When Elaine gently asked him what he was doing, he often responded with silence, or a vague, uneasy phrase like, "It's happening again." He never explained what it meant. In the daytime, Robert became increasingly distant. At work, he struggled to focus. Co-workers noticed that he seemed distracted even during simple tasks. Sometimes he would stop mid-conversation, as if something had interrupted his thoughts. Then he would quietly excuse himself and leave. At home, Elaine tried to maintain normal life with children. Meals were still cooked, school routines still followed, and smiles were still exchanged at the dinner table. But something about the atmosphere inside the house had changed. It felt heavier, quieter, almost like the walls themselves were absorbing sound. The children noticed it too. Sarah became withdrawn, spending more time alone in her room. Daniel stopped inviting friends over. And young Michael began refusing to sleep without a light on. He told his mother he heard soft noises at night, like footsteps moving slowly across the hallway when everyone was supposed to be asleep. Elaine initially dismissed these concerns as childhood fear, but her own experiences began to trouble her more deeply. She sometimes found objects moved slightly from where she left them. A chair angled differently. A cupboard left ajar. Nothing dramatic enough to prove anything, but enough to create doubt in her mind. Then came the notes. At first, they were small scraps of paper found in pockets, drawers, and between books. Then they became more frequent. Robert would write phrases without explanation, sometimes repeating them obsessively. They are watching. The house remembers. It started below. Elaine confronted him several times. Each time, Robert became defensive, not angry in a loud way, but tense, almost frightened. He insisted that something was happening that she could not see or understand. He refused to elaborate further. As the days passed, the emotional distance inside the home grew wider. Conversations became shorter. Meals became quieter. The sense of connection between family members slowly weakened, replaced by uncertainty and unease. And yet, despite everything, no one outside the home was called. No doctor, no counselor, no authority figure was brought in. The family remained isolated, trapped in their own confusion. Whatever was happening inside the Justus home was still invisible to the outside world, but it was no longer small, and it was no longer stable. Something inside the house was beginning to break open. The night everything changed did not begin with violence or chaos. It began like any other ordinary evening inside the Justus home. Dinner was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that fills a room when everyone is present, but no one feels like speaking. Robert sat at the table without much expression, answering questions in short, distant replies. Elaine noticed that his hands were slightly tense, resting too tightly against the edge of the table. Outside, the weather slowly shifted. Clouds gathered over the town without warning. What started as a light wind soon became a heavy storm. Rain struck rooftops in steady waves, and thunder rolled across the sky in deep, distant bursts. Lightning briefly lit up the neighborhood, casting sharp shadows through every window. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt increasingly uneasy. As the storm grew stronger, the lights flickered once. Then again, the third flicker lasted longer, and for a moment the entire house went dark. Only the sound of rain and wind remained. Then the power failed completely. In that moment of darkness, something shifted. Neighbors later reported hearing a loud crash from the direction of the Justus home. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Storms often cause falling branches, broken objects, or distant noises that echoed through the night. But shortly after, another sound followed. A scream. It was brief, sharp, and then it stopped. After that, there was nothing. No more movement. No more lights. No more sounds coming from a house. The storm continued through the night, but the Justus home remained completely still. By morning, the weather had passed. The sky was calm again. Birds returned. The neighborhood slowly resumed its normal rhythm. But the Justus house did not. Elaine's sister arrived later that morning after the family failed to appear at church. She noticed the front door was slightly open. That alone was unusual enough to raise concern. Elaine never left doors open. She was careful, organized, and consistent in her routines. Inside, the air felt wrong immediately. Not just quiet, but heavy, almost suffocating. She stepped further inside and saw signs of disturbance. Furniture was displaced. Items were scattered. A faint, unsettling odor lingered in the air, something metallic and sharp that did not belong in a normal home. A trail of disruption seemed to lead deeper into the house, guiding her toward the kitchen and beyond. At that point, fear replaced confusion. She immediately left the house and called emergency services. When authorities arrived, they approached the scene cautiously. None of them knew what they were about to find inside. But whatever had happened during that stormy night had already transformed the Justus home into something that no longer felt like a normal crime scene. It felt like the end of something far more disturbing. When police finally entered the Justus home, the silence inside felt unnatural. It wasn't the calm silence of an empty house. It was heavier, more suffocating, as if the air itself resisted being disturbed. Officers moved slowly through the entrance. Their flashlights cut through dim corridors, revealing a scene of disarray that immediately raised alarms. Furniture was overturned. Glass fragments crunched under their boots. Household items lay scattered in patterns that suggested panic, movement, and struggle. Yet one detail stood out almost immediately. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors were intact. Windows were not broken from the outside. Locks showed no clear evidence of tampering. It was as if whatever had happened inside the house had begun and ended without an external intruder. As they moved deeper, the atmosphere grew increasingly disturbing. The temperature inside felt inconsistent. Some rooms were normal, while others felt noticeably colder, especially areas leading toward the back of the house. Then came the markings. Handwritten notes were found in multiple locations. Not organized, not structured, just scattered fragments of thought written on scraps of paper, walls, and even torn pages from notebooks. The phrases repeated in different forms. They are still here. It watches from below. We should not have opened it. At first, investigators considered the possibility of a psychological breakdown, but the distribution of the notes made the situation more complex. They were not confined to one room or one person's belongings. They appeared throughout the house. As officers continued their search, they discovered the most critical part of the scene: the family members inside the home. The official details were never fully released to the public, but it was confirmed that multiple members of the Justus family were found deceased within different areas of the house. The arrangement of the scene suggested a violent and chaotic event, but not one that clearly pointed to an outside attacker. There were contradictions everywhere. No clear entry point. No consistent timeline. No obvious explanation. And then there was the basement. Several officers later described an uncomfortable feeling when approaching it. One reportedly stated that the basement felt wrong in a way that had no logical explanation. Others noted an unexplained drop in temperature and an overwhelming sense of unease that made extended time inside difficult. Despite this, the basement yielded no clear answers, only more silence. But one fact quickly became impossible to ignore. Robert Justus was missing. There was no sign of him inside the house. No body, no confirmed trace. Nothing that clearly indicated where he had gone after the events of that night. As investigators stepped back outside, the reality of the situation began to settle in. This was not a straightforward case. It was incomplete, fragmented, and deeply confusing. And whatever had happened inside the Justus home, it had not fully revealed itself yet. The discovery inside the Justus home raised more questions than it answered, but one detail quickly became the center of the investigation. Robert Justus was gone. There was no body inside the house. No clear indication of where he had been during the critical moments of the incident. No definitive trace suggesting whether he left before, during, or after the violent scene that unfolded inside the home. Authorities immediately began a search operation. The assumption at first was simple. Robert had fled the scene. Whether out of panic, confusion, or responsibility, he was considered the primary person of interest. But the search would soon take a more disturbing turn. 3 days later, a local hunter reported finding an abandoned vehicle deep in a wooded area several miles outside town. The location was remote, surrounded by dense trees and uneven ground, far from any normal travel route. When police arrived, they confirmed the vehicle belonged to Robert Justus. The car doors were unlocked. The interior was disorganized. Papers were scattered across the seats and floor. Some appeared to be notes, others rough sketches, maps, and fragments of writing that seemed increasingly erratic. The surrounding area showed no clear signs of struggle, no footprints leading away in a definite direction, no immediate evidence of another person being present. A short distance from the vehicle, officers discovered Robert's body. The condition of the scene did not provide a clear explanation of what had occurred. There were no obvious external injuries that immediately indicated a cause of death. The medical examination later suggested exposure and physical exhaustion as possible contributing factors, but nothing definitive could be confirmed with certainty. Inside the car, investigators found pages filled with disturbing content, repeated phrases referencing voices, references to fear and pursuit, and scattered symbols that appear to have no clear meaning. Among the most frequently repeated lines were, "They won't stop. It's still following me. They're under the house." Authorities leaned toward the explanation of severe psychological breakdown. According to the official interpretation, Robert likely experienced extreme paranoia following the incident at home, fled into the forest, and eventually succumbed to environmental conditions. But not everyone was convinced. Some investigators noted inconsistencies in timing and behavior. Others questioned how Robert managed to travel so far into the woods without leaving a clear trail, especially under such conditions. Locals also began to talk. Rumors spread that the forest where he was found felt unusually silent. Even wildlife seemed absent during certain periods. These claims were never verified, but they added to the growing unease surrounding the case. With Robert now dead, the investigation lost its primary subject. But instead of closure, the case only became more fragmented, because now there was no one left to explain what had truly happened inside the Justus home. Only evidence and unanswered questions. After the immediate investigation slowed, attention shifted away from the events of that night and toward something more unsettling. The place where it all happened, the Justus home itself. At first, it seemed like an ordinary suburban property. But as investigators and locals began looking deeper, small details about the land's past started to surface. Details that were not widely known and in some cases had been long forgotten. Records showed that the property had changed hands several times over the decades. Before the Justus family ever moved in, there had been another structure on the same land, an older house, reportedly built many years earlier, long before modern development reached the neighborhood. Local stories began to resurface. Some residents claimed that strange incidents had occurred on the property in earlier years, accidents that were never fully explained, people who lived there briefly but left suddenly, health issues that were described as unusual or unexpected. Most of these accounts were unverified, passed down through rumor rather than documentation, but they added a layer of unease to the case. During renovations years before the tragedy, some workers allegedly reported finding odd markings and debris beneath the house's foundation. These claims were never officially confirmed, but they included mentions of old materials, animal remains, and markings that did not appear to serve any structural purpose. Authorities, however, dismissed all such claims as coincidence and local superstition. In their view, there was no credible evidence linking the property's history to the events involving the Justus family. But the public perception was different. Once the tragedy became known, the house itself began to take on a reputation in the community. It was no longer just a location. It became a symbol of fear, a place people avoided, even in daylight. Teenagers in the area eventually turned it into a dare. Some claimed they approached the house at night and heard unexplained noises coming from inside. Others said they saw faint movement through windows that should have been empty. Whether these reports were real experiences or exaggerated stories was never confirmed, but they spread quickly through local conversations. Eventually, the decision was made to demolish the structure entirely. The house was torn down, leaving only empty ground where it once stood. But the demolition did not end the story. If anything, it intensified it, because removing the physical structure did not remove the questions attached to it. Why did a seemingly normal family unravel so completely inside that house? And more importantly, was the house simply the setting of a tragedy or part of something deeper that was never fully understood? The answers, if they ever existed, were no longer visible in the physical world, only in memory and in speculation. As months passed after the demolition of the Justus home, the case slowly moved from active investigation into analysis, debate, and speculation. With no definitive explanation that satisfied every detail, the tragedy became a subject to conflicting interpretations. Officially, investigators leaned toward a tragic psychological breakdown within the family, centered around Robert Justus. In this view, escalating paranoia, emotional isolation, and possible mental illness created a situation that spiraled beyond control. The notes found in the house, the fragmented writing in the car, and Robert's increasingly erratic behavior were all seen as consistent with severe mental distress. From a clinical perspective, this explanation made sense. Stress, sleep deprivation, and untreated psychological conditions can distort perception and lead to dangerous conclusions. Many professionals who reviewed the case publicly supported this interpretation as the most grounded and realistic. However, not everyone accepted it so easily. Some independent researchers pointed out unresolved inconsistencies. The timeline of events inside the house was never fully reconstructed with certainty. Witness reports about noises and possible activity after the estimated time of death added confusion to the official narrative. Even small contradictions in statements from responders created space for doubt. The lack of forced entry also remained a point of discussion. If the incident was entirely internal, as authorities suggested, then every action inside the house had to be explained without external involvement. Yet certain details resisted simple interpretation. The basement, in particular, became a focal point of speculation. Several officers had described discomfort when entering it, though nothing physically abnormal was documented. Still, those subjective reactions fueled conversations about whether there was something psychologically or environmentally unusual about that part of the house. Over time, alternative theories began to circulate outside official channels. Some suggested that an unidentified external influence may have played a role in destabilizing Robert's mental state before the tragedy. Others believed there could have been a misunderstanding of events inside the house due to incomplete evidence or missing context. And then there were the more unconventional theories, those that stepped outside traditional explanation entirely. These ideas, often discussed in online forums and local storytelling, suggested that the property itself carried a disturbing influence. While no scientific evidence supported such claims, they persisted in public imagination. What made the Justus case so enduring was not just the violence of what occurred, but the gaps left behind. Every explanation seemed to resolve one question while creating another. Psychological collapse explained behavior, but not every inconsistency. Environmental stress explained fear, but not every detail of the scene. And speculative theories filled emotional gaps, but lacked proof. In the end, no single theory was able to fully contain the case. Instead, the Justus tragedy became something else entirely. Not just a crime, not just a mystery, but a collection of unresolved fragments that refused to align into a complete picture. And that lack of closure is exactly what keeps the story alive. Even after the investigation slowed and the physical evidence was gone, the impact of the Justus family tragedy remained deeply embedded in the community. For many residents, it was not just a case they had read about in passing. It became a defining moment that changed how they viewed safety, trust, and even their own homes. In the weeks following the incident, the neighborhood felt different. Conversations that once flowed easily became more cautious. People lowered their voices when speaking about the Justus family, as if mentioning the name itself carried a kind of weight. What had once been an ordinary household was now something people avoided discussing directly. Parents became more protective. Doors that were previously left unlocked were now double-checked at night. Windows were secured earlier in the evening. Even simple routines, like children playing outside after sunset, began to change. A quiet sense of vulnerability spread through the area. Children who grew up nearby remembered hearing fragments of the story over time. Not the full details, but pieces passed along in whispers, each version slightly different, each one more unsettling than the last. For many of them, the Justus house became a symbol used in warnings, a reminder of what could happen when something goes wrong inside a home no one suspects. Even after the house was demolished, the location itself did not fully lose its reputation. Some residents admitted they still felt uneasy when passing the empty lot. Others avoided the area entirely at night, even though nothing physical remained to see. Psychologists often explain this kind of response as collective memory, when a traumatic event becomes embedded in the identity of a place. People do not need visible reminders to feel its presence. The memory alone is enough to alter behavior. But in this case, something about the Justus tragedy seemed to linger more strongly than others. It was not just the event itself, but the unanswered nature of it. The lack of clarity left space for imagination, and imagination often grows stronger than fact over time. As years passed, the story began to evolve. In local retellings, details changed. Some versions emphasized psychological breakdown. Others leaned toward hidden secrets or unexplained forces. Each retelling added emotional intensity, even when accuracy faded. For those who lived through it, however, the core feeling remained the same: uncertainty. It was not knowing exactly what happened that stayed with people. It was the inability to fully close the story. Even new residents who moved into the area years later would sometimes hear about the case, not as a detailed report, but as a cautionary tale, something spoken briefly and then left hanging in silence. And so, the Justus Family Tragedy slowly transitioned from a real event into something more lasting in the community's memory. A story that shaped behavior, a memory that influenced fear, and a mystery that refused to fade completely. As investigators and researchers revisited the Justus Family Tragedy over time, one issue continued to stand out above all others: the number of details that resisted a single, unified explanation. Each piece of evidence, when viewed individually, could be interpreted in a rational way, but when placed together, the case became increasingly difficult to align into one consistent narrative. Start with the behavior of Robert Justus. His gradual withdrawal, the fragmented notes, and the reported paranoia all suggested severe psychological distress. On paper, this explanation remains the most grounded interpretation. Mental health crises can escalate quietly, often unnoticed until a breaking point occurs. But then there were other elements that did not fit neatly into that explanation alone. The condition of the home raised questions about timing and sequence. The lack of forced entry suggested that whatever happened inside began internally, yet the chaotic arrangement of the scene implied multiple moments of disruption rather than a single event. Witness reports added further complexity. Some neighbors claimed to hear sounds during a time window that did not fully align with the official timeline established later. While such reports can be unreliable, their existence contributed to ongoing uncertainty. The handwritten notes found throughout the house remain one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Phrases like "it watches from below" and "the house remembers" are often interpreted as signs of psychological collapse. Yet their repetition and distribution throughout different areas of the home created a sense of structure that some found difficult to dismiss as purely random. Even the missing family pet became part of the unresolved picture. No confirmed explanation was ever provided for its disappearance, and it was never recovered. While not central to the case, it remains another detail without closure. Then there's the basement. Although no physical evidence was ever found there to suggest anything unusual, multiple responders independently reported discomfort. Whether this was psychological suggestion or environmental coincidence has never been proven. Still, the consistent emotional reactions became part of the case's narrative. What makes the Justus tragedy persist in public memory is not any single unexplained element. It is the accumulation of them. Each gap in understanding adds weight to the others, creating a layered sense of uncertainty. In most cases, investigations eventually converge on a clear explanation, even if imperfect. But here, every path of reasoning seems to leave something unresolved. Psychological explanations account for behavior, but not every detail of the scene. Procedural explanations account for evidence, but not every witness claim. Speculative interpretations attempt to fill the gaps, but lack verification. As a result, the case exists in a space where certainty is difficult to maintain. It becomes less about finding a single truth and more about acknowledging the limits of what can be known from incomplete evidence. And in that space between explanation and uncertainty, the Justus Family Tragedy continues to hold attention, not because it is fully understood, but because it never fully resolves. The story of the Justus Family Tragedy does not end with a clear conclusion, a final explanation, or a moment of resolution. Instead, it fades into something far more uncomfortable, uncertainty that refuses to settle. Over time, most cases like this eventually find closure. Evidence is pieced together. Motives are identified. Timelines are reconstructed with enough confidence to form a narrative that satisfies both investigators and the public. But the Justus case never fully reached that point. It remains suspended between explanation and mystery. On one hand, the most grounded interpretation suggests a devastating psychological collapse, a gradual breakdown inside a single household, where stress, isolation, and internal fear built quietly until they erupted into tragedy. In that view, the case is deeply human, painful, but understandable within the limits of mental health struggles. On the other hand, there are details that never fully settle into that explanation. Small inconsistencies, witness recollections that don't perfectly align, physical arrangements that remain open to interpretation, and fragments of behavior and writing that, while explainable individually, feel incomplete when viewed as a whole. What makes the story endure is not just what is known, but what is missing. There is no final recorded confession that explains everything. No complete, verified account from a surviving witness. No single piece of evidence that definitively ties every element together into one undeniable version of events. Instead, they're fragments. A quiet neighborhood. A family that seemed ordinary. A night of storm and silence. A home that became the center of something no one fully understood. And a set of unanswered questions that continue to linger long after the physical site was gone. Over the years, the Justus Family Tragedy has become more than just a case file. It has become a story retold in different forms, some grounded in facts, others shaped by interpretation, fear, or imagination. Each retelling reflects not only the event itself, but also the human need to make sense of what remains unclear. Perhaps that is why it continues to be discussed. Not because it offers answers, but because it highlights how fragile understanding can be when information is incomplete. In the end, the most unsettling part of the Justus tragedy is not a single detail, but the absence of closure, the feeling that something significant happened, but not everything about it can be fully recovered or explained. And so the story remains where it has always been since that night, unfinished, unresolved, and quietly enduring in memory. Some mysteries are solved with time, others simply remain. And the Justus Family Tragedy is one of those stories that refuses to fully disappear. If you enjoy dark mysteries and true crime documentaries, subscribe to the Crit Stories for more chilling stories. Stay curious, but stay aware.